So I can't resist telling a Donna Shalala story since she's not here to defend herself. When I was a young professor at Madison, she was about to become chancellor, and I went to hear a talk by her at the student union. And the student union had these very high podiums. And if you remember Donna from our previous meetings, she's even shorter than I am. So she came up to the podium, and she was kind of looking around it, couldn't see the audience, and said, first thing I'm going to do as chancellor is lower all the podiums. And apparently they got a little box for her for every talk she ever gave so that she didn't look so short. So a few months later, she was chancellor by then, and I walked into a new classroom that I was teaching in, and the podium came up to my nose, and I was quite irritated because my students couldn't see me, and I thought it really undercut my authority in the classroom, and it was just inconvenient. So I immediately dashed off an email to Donna and said, you know, I heard you say that the first thing you'll do when you come to Madison is lower all the podiums. I just want to point out that the one in 174 Russell Labs has not been lowered, and I think it's very damaging to women faculty to have podiums that are that high. And I assumed I wasn't going to get an answer, and I didn't immediately, and so I assumed that would be the end of that conversation. And it was really said facetiously more than anything. I didn't expect her to do anything. But 45 minutes later, this guy comes barreling into my office and says, I hear you have a podium problem. The chancellor wants it fixed right away. And that's what our dear Donna Shalala can do. And my podium was lower for the rest of my career there. So I'm really honored to introduce Bartlett Russell, who will be our next speaker, who's going to talk about In My Genes, the legacy of Bernadine Healy.
Hello. First of all, I would also like to start out by thanking the Rosalind Franklin Society for inviting me to speak. I'm overwhelmed with the accomplishments of the members of the society and of the women in this room. And if it wasn't enough pressure to do justice to my mother's legacy, I have to do so in a room full of women with legacies of their own. I am humbled, honored, inspired, and more than a little apprehensive, but I wasn't about to pass up this opportunity when Dr. Shepard-Rubinger tracked me down. Dr. Bernadine Healy, my mother, was supposed to be addressing you today, but she passed away from brain cancer in August of this year, 4 days after her 67th birthday. In asking me to speak instead, I think the Society was hoping I could bring you some of her knowledge and insight into the challenges women face in scientific practice, leadership, and policy making. As a woman in science and a daughter to the trailblazer, this is a logical approach. At this point, I think previously I was going to say I'm a poor substitute, but I'm learning to promote myself, so I'm going to skip that. This is partly because my own experience, though, in science has been very different from my mother's. She was one of very few women in her class in medical school. I'm finishing my doctorate at a time when there are more women earning PhDs in my particular field. I think that one line that hit above 50% in the first speech today. And anecdotally, 8 of my 10 incoming class members in my cohort were women. 7 of us who remain are all women. And when I arrived, the chair of my home department in kinesiology was a woman. She's still a woman. She's just no longer chair. This is a testament to her and to your successes. She and you all have done such a good job in pushing the boundaries that I turned to science precisely because of the opportunities and legitimacy it offered me as a woman in national security. From where I stand in my scientific career, I'm just beginning to see the front lines. In that sense, I can offer a little more than you already know and have experienced about what it's like to be a woman in science and the challenges that still face women in science. You've lived it, and you know the stats. Instead, what I hope to do today is to tell you a bit about my mother's achievements, not just as a woman accomplished in her scientific career, but also as an advocate for women's health research. Those that worked with her in one of her many offices are probably better suited to give you the gritty details of each of her battles and triumphs. As a member of her family, I hope I can trace for you some of the more common threads and motivations that drove and enabled her throughout her career. The first among these threads was her perpetual dual role as both student and teacher. recounting the point in her life when she was asked to be the first woman director of the National Institutes of Health, she wrote simply, "I was prepared and I knew where we needed to go." She was prepared because she studied the issues and knew a major gap in modern health research sat squarely over the female half of the population. So my mother was one of 4 daughters. She's this one. In over. She grew up in a tiny apartment above my grandfather's perfume factory in Long Island City, New York. Both of my grandparents were forced to abandon high school due to financial hardship after the loss of a parent. Their subsequent struggles led my grandfather to believe that education was the path. There were no other options. The path towards financial security. It made no difference that he had daughters rather than sons, and he pushed them all towards college despite their priest's warnings that these young ladies might become overeducated. Even if education trumped church in the Healy household, although I'm not sure those Irish Catholics, well, we as Irish Catholics, would ever admit to that, they were very poor, and scholarships were the only way these 4 girls were going to college. Grandpa Healy's toughness paid off. My mother earned a full ride to Vassar and then again a full ride to Harvard Medical School, where she was one of 3 women in her graduating class. There they are. From there, she went to Johns Hopkins University to finish her residency and eventually became one of the first women to earn the title of full professor at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. I believe you know the rest of what you could see on her resume. She advised White House science policy for 2 presidents, directed the National Institutes of Health, served as dean of Ohio State School of Medicine, was the president of the American Heart Association and then later the American Red Cross. She's served on boards, appeared on countless news shows. She was CBS's medical correspondent and then later U.S. News's medical columnist. What you may not know is that during all of this, she also raised 2 daughters, ran a household while commuting to D.C. and Columbus from Cleveland, cared for her mother during a 10-year decline into Alzheimer's, and then fought her own 13-year on-again, off-again battle with brain cancer. All of this was driven by her commitment to educate herself and those around her. And her life as a perpetual student shaped the way she approached each of these roles. As a doctor and a medical professor, she learned from her patients and encouraged them to learn as much about their own health as possible. She would have loved all of the presentations today, but especially the one on breast cancer for this reason. The whole purpose of her first book, A New Prescription for Women's Health, was to educate women about the health issues she saw as most likely to influence a woman's life. In it, she outlines the major risk factors in the current knowledge, circa 95, of a select set of 10 health issues, from cardiovascular disease to osteoporosis, stroke, and reproductive health. The construction of the book is illustrative of her teaching approach. There are 2 sections at the ends of each chapter. The first is questions you can ask your doctor, and the second was what women can do personally and politically, which, including instructions for a political movement in a book on women's health that's for the greater public, to me seemed takes a lot of foresight. She also explicitly stated her purpose for writing the book in this way. I've written this with a deep commitment to the idea that the empowerment of the individual woman is possible only through knowledge, and that the informed, confident woman can find the strength and competence to demand the health care she deserves. My mom loved to teach, and she taught to empower. In this way, the mission of the society is the same as hers was, to educate the public on the important topics about women that have been wrongly ignored. I was living with my mom back in 2003 when she wrote the column Let's Remember Rosie for U.S. News and World Report on the 50th anniversary of the discovery of DNA. Outraged by what she learned, she loved the idea of a society dedicated to recognizing the accomplishments of women in science. And in preparation for today, I asked a few of my friends and colleagues about what their opinions were about what are the major things affecting women in science today. I'm very sorry to report that none of them knew who Rosalind Franklin was. I'm even sorry to report that the majority of these were women. And it wasn't a consolation to me that they weren't scientists, because they all knew who Watson and Crick were. She would have been disappointed and probably not very surprised. She believed these messages needed to reach beyond the bench into the homes of the non-geeky greater public to truly create change. And while at NIH, she felt this was also the only way to make progress, and it was to educate the public about the problems she saw as fundamental. With the help of a few key congressional players, including Senators Barbara Mikulski, Olympia Snowe, Representatives Connie Morella, and Patricia Schroeder, this is exactly what she did in starting the Women's Health Initiative and in overseeing the expansion of the Office of Research in Women's Health under Vivian Pinn. She credited the press particularly for getting the message out and circulating it in a way that provided the grassroots support they all needed to get this done. She felt the success of this triad, the NIH, Congress, and the press, was an example of Washington at its best. She said of the time that if there was a powerful notion among this group, they could not let their daughters down. It was a moral imperative. If trials only included men, the results could only be applied with confidence to men. No one could learn about how disease differed in women if the data were never collected. This brings me to the next major thread of my mother's career. She lived and celebrated women as women and rejected the notion of women as female men. When I was in elementary school, we took a family trip to Greece, where I first learned of my mother's fondness for Athena, who was on the first slide. She was the Greek goddess of wisdom, heroism, and the strategic side of warfare. We have a small helmeted bust of her in our foyer still. She's calm but resolute, and Athena was a patron of knowledge, of universities, and I think Bryn Mawr, is that right? Yeah, that's what yeah. And she preferred logic and skill for the resolution of disputes, but could take up arms when necessary. She argued for what was right and had the muscle to back it up. Unlike her counterpart Apollo, she was not the hot-headed aggressor, but the level-headed enforcer. This won her enough respect from the Greeks that it was after Athens was named for her, excuse me, and the Acropolis was built for her. It may not be surprising that I, too, a girl who eventually chose national security as her first career, had a fondness for this G.I. Jane of her time. Later in college, I learned of one interpretation of why Athena was so appealing to the male-dominated Greeks of her day. Apparently, Athena was celebrated as the ideal woman primarily because she did not exhibit the typical undesirable female traits. Athena was born to Zeus alone. She popped fully grown from his head and thus did not suffer the influence of a mother. The myths that surrounded the jealous and meddling Hera and the boy-crazed Aphrodite provide some indication of how ancient Greeks viewed women. Though in their defense, most of the gods were mischievous and ill-behaved. Still, both Mom and I felt a little betrayed by our gray-eyed heroine. Here we thought she was the example of reason and strength best embodied by a woman. Could she really be reduced to a female man? This mentality didn't crumble with ancient Athens, and acting like one of the guys in a male-dominated context can be really tempting. It's easier to gain acceptance and to avoid making waves. Well, Mom never felt like she had to act like a man to find success. In fact, quite the opposite. And we were talking about pink earlier. Well, my mom was a woman who chose a pink suit for her portrait as NIH director. In this, I think I've taken after her a bit, not only because I'm wearing pink today, but I think I'm also the only person I know to have worn heels at a nuclear attack sub, which was a challenge, but you can make it work. But beyond her wardrobe, Bernie, as some called her, she was not opposed to making waves. On the contrary, she raised a tsunami over the exclusion of women in scientific research and the tacit assumption that findings from male populations in all things not reproductive could just be applied to women. At the time, it wasn't only a challenge for women to be here in the byline. It was a challenge for women to be represented in the studies themselves. This particular study screened almost 540,000 participants and enrolled just under 13,000. I'm sure you already know how many of these were women. 0. Of course, I chose this example for a reason, but this was indicative of a larger problem. And it meant really bad things for women, including the increased side effects from drugs never tested on them to the outright denial of some treatments deemed not yet safe for them, like stents, when they first came out. The underrepresentation led to a general unfamiliarity with how disease presented differently in women than in men. And as a result, studies that did not include women were often ill-designed and assumed a common presentation and progression of disease. This was the case for the Framingham study, which started off examining the effects of cholesterol and heart disease in people between their 40s and 70s. So everybody in the cohort, in the initial cohort, was between mid-40s and mid-70s. Unfortunately, for women suffering from cardiovascular disease, they were most likely to present in their 80s. This message is simple. No more excuses. My mom's message was simple. No more excuses. Risk of pregnancy, cost, and added complexity of having to track participants' menstrual phase were not reasons for exclusion. But just as research studies need women, so too does industry. I read an article recently about Wall Street called The Testosterone Trap. I'm not sure if any of you saw it. It's interesting, though. The article lamented the general lack of interest among women to become day traders. The authors cited research suggesting Wall Street needs more women because they make fewer overall trades, and those who make fewer trades tend to do better in the long run. Of course, on average. Without having seen the original studies, it's hard for me to really gauge their quality, and I hate to reduce the contribution of women just to our hormones. Just as the IOM's 2010 study on women's health research highlights the importance of societal and cultural issues in women's health, I think that women bring societal and cultural influence to industry that, as much as estrogen does. The good news for women and employers alike is that fields previously unattractive to women may become more so as technology advances. This is no secret for you. There are more tools enabling mothers to balance work and motherhood. There are definitely still challenges. That's absolutely clear. But I'm not sure my mom would have ever worried as much about commuting if she knew she could, praise and scold my sister and I over Skype. So there might have been some truth in my professor's interpretation of Athena. But ultimately, she was envisioned as a woman, not as a man. She was the most sensible of all the mythological caricatures of her time, and the unique combination of power and wisdom was not granted to her male counterpart. So let's not be so hard on Athena. Just as the Women's Health Initiative and the Office of Women's Health Research have advocated, we women come in all types, and not all of us wear pink. So finally, I'll close with just a little about my own experience as a woman professional. Though for my mother, being a woman in medicine and science was inherently a challenge. As I mentioned before, I've recently, 4 years ago, turned to science specifically for the opportunities it affords me as a woman. My mother chose to challenge the boys' club of her day, not because she wanted to pick a fight, but simply because that was her career of choice. In starting my master's in security studies shortly after college, I chose a path in another rather male-dominated field of defense, and I did so for the same reason. It interests me, and I think I can contribute. I combined my undergraduate knowledge of science and my master's and found a niche translating the implications of biotechnological advancements for those in the Department of Defense who essentially don't speak geek. There are many wonderful exceptions to the default of male leadership in science, including Michelle Flournoy, the first chief policy advisor to the Secretary of Defense, and General Ann Dunwoody, the first female four-star. Just as an aside, I learned this morning that Michelle Flournoy had announced that she's stepping down and cited a need to rebalance her personal and professional career as a result. So that was very sad for me. Anyway, in any event, since national defense is still largely about the military, and the military is largely a male institution, it's still an industry dominated by male thought, even if not always by male leadership. One of my mentors was also my first boss. He's a retired Army colonel, West Point grad, and the father of 2 daughters. He maintained that regardless of how capable, one's legitimacy in the field is greatly improved by having either military service or a doctorate. Having one of these is even more important for a woman. As often happens among people with mutual interests, I fell in love and married one of my colleagues. He was a coworker in a PhD in anthropology. though I wanted to adopt his last name for purely practical reasons. Bulkley is hard to pronounce and even harder to spell. Initially, I refused to do so over concern that publishing or presenting our work as Dr. and Mrs. Russell would undercut and minimize my contribution to our work. My mentor, the Colonel, he really reinforced what I think I already knew. Lucky for me, I was happy to return to school. I had a supportive husband and landed a fellowship that made it financially feasible. Most importantly, part of my work identified a need for a class of research that seemed to fall between the cracks of the existing medical military infrastructures. It's an area that I really would like to help develop. For me, growing up in a household where my mother was advising science policy, or White House policy, while I was still in diapers, and the idea of women in science was never really questioned. And it seemed a natural complement to my master's for what I wanted to accomplish, for what I still want to accomplish. I have yet to see if I'm right. I still have about a year left. That's fingers crossed. But hopefully this anecdote gives you a little reassurance that the advocacy you're providing for the advances of women in science is benefiting women in other industries as well. There are many other aspects of my mom's career and legacy that I would have liked to share with you all, from her excitement for future multidisciplinary research to her commitment to building the right teams with effective people, and the many symbols of motherhood I associate with her, such as the telltale, the telltale white FedEx box of work that came from D.C. It would arrive each Friday in our house in Cleveland, just hours before she would come home on the plane after her week of work. So this is, non-traditional methods of motherhood. I confess that when I think of my mother and I as two generations of scientists, I don't envision us with white coats in the lab. Instead, I think of when I was living with her in D.C. in her apartment while working on my master's at Georgetown. She had just begun to write for U.S. News and was still commuting between Cleveland and the district. During the week, we worked side by side on our respective projects, almost like college roommates. And most roommates raid each other's closets. And though we did that too, we were more often raiding each other's desks for like tape flags and the prized pocket-sized dictionary that was really handy when writing on the run. She'd read me drafts of her articles, and I'd read her drafts of my papers. We fervently discussed the recent scientific findings as though they were juicy pieces of gossip. Oh my gosh, did you see what they heard? Did you hear about what they found out about ulcers? They're actually caused by bacteria. It also makes me feel bad for the motherless and mentorless Athena, who, despite all her godlike wisdom, won't understand the many challenges, but also the many opportunities that come with the very human experience of being a woman in science. And she could have learned a thing or two from Rosie. I don't know if there's any questions, but I'm not.
Thank you. Your mother came in for some criticism by the famous James Watson in his, and I just wondered what you had to say about the Watson-Healy relationship.
Well, my mother came under a lot of criticism because, as I said, she wasn't afraid of making waves. So if you could be more specific about what particular criticism, that would help me out, because there was...
Well, he's I forget which of his, it's not in the Double Helix, but I think it's in his autobiographies, which he describes the conflict he had with Bernadine Healy. And I said to him, what was wrong with her? I said, well, surely she was intelligent. He said, yes, she was intelligent. She just didn't know anything.
Oh, well, I think he's dead wrong. In fact, I know he's wrong. She knew more than anybody I'd met that I've ever known.
Did she comment about him at all?
No, she didn't, but that doesn't mean she didn't to me, I should say. One of the things that's been most eye-opening for me since her passing is that I've had the opportunity to really meet a lot of her colleagues that I hadn't previously. They all had these stories that, she was, she did bring her work home, but she was also very good at separating. When she was with the family, she might have been working, but she was still with the family, so she definitely left. She didn't come home burdened with a lot of these things. So I'm sorry I can't give you more commentary on what she felt about it, but she probably ignored it.
I hope so.
Yeah. Thank you.